The end of the civil wars and the establishment of a new political regime in Rome were marked by large-scale Roman expansion in Europe, Asia and Africa. The first emperor Octavian Augustus put forward an ambitious project of Rome's conquest of world domination. Throughout his reign there were almost continuous wars, accompanied by the conquest of lands and the emergence of new provinces. This policy began with the conquest of northwestern Spain. When the last troops left Mark Antony and he committed suicide, Cleopatra followed him to the other world a week later. On the same day Caesar Octavian occupied Alexandria with his troops. Egypt was occupied and became a Roman province. The riches of the Ptolemaic royal treasury were displayed in a magnificent three-day triumph that marked Octavian's return to Rome. The era of the civil wars had come to an end. Octavian announced the resignation of his emergency powers. Formally, this gesture restored senatorial rule, but in reality the republican facade only hid the essence of the regime of personal power, which Octavian continued to use until the end of his days. The structure of the regime and its operating mechanisms were formed gradually. Octavian was elected consul annually, and later became elected from time to time. With the powers of censor, he was able to tightly control the composition of the Senate. Finally, the lifetime powers of the tribune allowed him to reject any undesirable bill and at the same time gave him the right of personal immunity. To keep in his hands control over the army, Octavian, now Augustus, divided with the Senate provinces. Under his authority went to 7 border provinces, not completely pacified, on the territory of which still continued hostilities and troops. To manage them, he received from the Senate a large proconsular empire, acting also on the territory of Rome. Such powers gave Octavian the opportunity to recruit troops, to carry out military command, to rule the court and manage the provinces personally or through his viceroy's legates. The latter were appointed by Augustus at his own discretion from among the trusted persons of senatorial rank. Formally, these rights were temporary and transferred to him for 10 years, but at the end of this period, they were again extended. Broad powers allowed Augustus to celebrate triumph even in honor of victories won by other commanders. In time, this right was monopolized by the emperor and members of his family, and the rest of us had to make do with triumphal decorations. Expansionist policies became an integral part of the new mode of government. Augustus put forward and justified an ambitious project of conquering world domination. At the end of the civil wars, all nations were to bow under Rome's rule, so that, in the words of Virgil, the greatest Roman poet and personal friend of Augustus, the borders of Roman power would coincide with the borders of the inhabited world. The first testing ground where Roman weapons were used in the new foreign policy was Spain. Spain became one of the first overseas provinces of Rome, but its final conquest took almost 200 years. The tribes of Cantabres, Astores and Gallics, who lived in the mountainous and inaccessible areas of the northern and northwestern part of the Iberian Peninsula, still maintained their independence and ravaged the lands of Roman allies, Carpathia and Vacae. Despite an abundance of victories and triumphs, 6 of them were celebrated in the decade preceding Augustus' Spanish campaign alone. Decisive success in the struggle eluded the Roman commanders. Augustus announced his intention to finally complete the conquest of Spain. As supreme pontiff, he personally opened the gates of the Temple of Janus, which he had previously locked on the occasion of the cessation of the civil wars. In the same year the movement of additional troops into the recalcitrant province began. Augustus assumed the office of consul while in the provincial capital of Tarragona. Here he came from Gaul, where in his presence Mark Valerius Messala Corvinus defeated the rebellious Aquitanians, thus completing the conquest of Aquitaine. With the arrival of Augustus the last preparations for war were completed. The headquarters became Segasama, where a united camp of the Roman army was established. The war plan envisioned close cooperation between the 3 autonomous army groups and the navy, which was to land in the enemy's rear. Each group was commanded by legates. The fulfillment of the tasks was complicated by the mountainous nature of the terrain and elusive enemy, adhering to the tactics of guerrilla warfare. With the onset of summer, the Roman army 3 columns invaded Cantabria. During the offensive, successfully overcoming the resistance of the enemy, the central column under the command of Antistius Beta paved the way to Velica and after a long siege took by storm the fortress of Aracelius. This victory opened the way for the Romans to the Atlantic coast at Santander. Another column under the command of Titus Carisius, advancing, probably from the north, successfully joined the first. At the walls of the city of Bergida, Roman army won a decisive victory over the gathered forces of Cantabrian. Those who managed to escape from the battlefield fled to the impregnable summit of Mount Vinius, which is identified today as Picos de Europa, one of the highest peaks of the Cantabrian Cordilleras, located on the border of Cantabria and Asturias. Here the Romans cut off their enemies from food supplies, but they were only able to capture the impregnable stronghold after most of its defenders had starved to death. At the beginning of the following year, the war in Cantabria was complicated by the entry of the Asturians. 3 Roman legions under the command of Titus Carisius wintered on the frontier of Asturias. The barbarians secretly came down from the mountains and decided to attack each of the camps on the same day, thus destroying the Roman army piece by piece. Thanks to the treachery of the breach signs, this plan became known to the Roman commander. At the very last moment, Carisius was able to strike a preemptive strike on the prepared to attack the enemy detachments and defeated them, not cheaply delivered victory. Pursuing the fleeing, he besieged them in the fortress of Lankia, cut them off from food supplies and forced them to lay down their arms by threat of starvation. While Carisius was besieging Lankia, Antistius Vetus and Furnius undertook an invasion of Gaul in the remote northwestern part of the peninsula. The route of their armies took them past future Leon and Astorga, through Montañas de Leon to the Bierzo Valley. As in the campaign of the previous year, from the seacoast the army's operations were supported by the fleet. Many Asturians took refuge on Mount Medulius, where they were besieged by the Romans who soon appeared. During the siege, the Romans encircled the entire mountain with a continuous line of fortifications. When it became clear to the defenders that it was impossible to break through the line of Roman trenches, they chose to commit suicide. They held a funeral feast, competing in their choice of death, by sword, fire or poison, which they usually extracted from the yew tree. The greater part of them preferred death, thus freeing themselves from captivity, which to them, at that time still unconquered, seemed heavier than death. Augustus watched the end of the war from Tarragon, to which he had returned after falling seriously ill. From there, having solemnly announced the victory won, he set out for Rome. His return to the capital, Horace welcomed a new ode, in which he compared Augustus to Hercules and anticipated the coming establishment of peace. Propaganda emphasized Augustus' role as a peacemaker. As a sign that nowhere in the Roman dominions are not waging war, on his arrival in Rome, Augustus ordered the Temple of Janus to be closed for the second time. In Spain, to commemorate the successes won, colonies were founded, to which were brought retired veterans of the past campaign. In reality, complete victory was still a long way off. As soon as Augustus left the province, the recently subjugated Asturians and Cantabrians overran the garrisons in their lands and revolted again. Lucius Aelius Lamia, whom Augustus left behind to govern the province, became involved in a full-scale war, during which Cantabria was again devastated. Prisoners captured in arms were chopped off their hands as punishment for resistance. With ever-increasing ferocity, the war continued for another 3 years. Only Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who especially for the sake of it was called Augustus from Gaul, managed to inflict a decisive defeat on the rebels. After that, His troops began to methodically destroy the mountain fortifications of the Asturians and resettle their inhabitants on the plain. The victory cost the Roman army huge losses, which caused Agrippa to reject the triumph decreed to him by the Senate. The final conquest of the country took decades. Again and again rebellions rose, but they were mostly localized and did not compare to the fierce wars of the previous 2 centuries. Immediately after the suppression of the revolt, the number of Roman troops in Spain was reduced to 3 legions. The rest went to Gaul and northern Italy, where at that time unfolded military operations to conquer the Alpine region. Under Augustus' successors, the number of legions was reduced to 2, and then to 1, which was sufficient to maintain order in the region. During the reign of Augustus and under his successors, Spain became the object of intensive colonization. New urban centers were established in the northwest of the country. The emergence of cities and the ensuing economic development contributed to the Romanization and final pacification of the country to the greatest extent possible. Ennius Florus wrote about these successes. The tranquility and lasting peace that ensued were the result both of the natural peacefulness of the Spaniards and of the wise orders of Caesar, who, fearing their flight into the mountains, ordered the settlement and cultivation of the area in the valley where his camps were located. Here he ordered a meeting of the tribe, and this place was considered the capital. The natural conditions of the area were favorable. It abounded in gold, chrysocolla, cinnabar and other colors. That is why Augustus ordered the land to be plowed. So the Asturians began to familiarize themselves with the riches and treasures of their land, although they did not mind them for themselves, but for others.